Hey everyone, welcome to another session of the Organizer Education Group with Cooperation Tulsa. We will be continuing our reading of the book Full Spectrum Resistance. I appreciate everybody who's showing up live, but also those of you who are watching afterwards. This is going to be dual streamed on the Anark channel and on the Cooperation Tulsa YouTube channel. We actually got quite a few people here tonight ready to read. So if everybody wants to, in the chat, put in what order you'd like to go, we can get started sometime soon. But also like to test to see if people can be heard on the live stream. So if somebody that is in the Jitsi can speak a little bit, and then we'll see if that can be heard on the live stream.
Hello.
Hiya.
Testing 1, 2.
I don't know if anybody has a stream up to check, but if anybody is watching the live stream, if you could just tell us if you could hear them when they said stuff there, they got the testing. Cool. Sounds like they heard you. Think we are in the clear. Nice. It worked. I got it set up within the first minute or two rather than us having to waste like 20 minutes of me trying to get it set up. Get hyped. Cool. So it looks like we already have our first 5 readers. And I checked in the chat. Looks like this is actually where we ended. So I think we're also not going to be reading over anything we've already read. So we are consummate professionals at this point. People should just start paying us money. Before we get started, however, speaking of money, we are, if you would like to become part of the reading group that is actually reading passages during these meetings, you should go over to the Open Collective link that is in the description. And you should go become a recurring donor to Cooperation Tulsa. Open Collective is how we make most of our recurring income. You'll also get an invite to the Cooperation Tulsa Discord server. So that's pretty cool. You'll be able to see the internal communications for Cooperation Tulsa of us talking with people in the community, as well as telling people about when our education groups are going to be taking place. And that includes the Organizer Education Group, as well as the Popular Education Group, which takes place on alternating Mondays. So yeah, that is a great way to help the organization. And obviously, if you give any super chats this evening to the Anark channel, I will just donate those super chats straight to Cooperation Tulsa. So yeah, I think that is the spiel. I think we are basically good to go. I'm going to be the first person who reads. Yeah, it looks like we got 6 readers this evening. Y'all are in for a treat. So, getting started here. This is a continuation of what we were reading before, so I'll just get started there. And we fight because it works. We know it works because of the dozens of nations that have successfully expelled dictators or colonizers over the past half century. Here, let me get this set up correctly. There we go. We know because women in most of the world can own property, vote, and conduct their own affairs. We know because slavery has been largely wiped out in the Americas. We know because workers in much of the world have the right to form unions and to 8-hour workday. Gaetan Heroux of the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty told me, quote, "Poor people will never, ever get the basis of what they need to live unless they fight for it, because that's how it was won. They won't give it to us by quiet, polite meetings. It was never won like that," end quote. Consider the suffragists. In the late 19th century, women in England lobbied hard for the right to vote, but their polite requests for equal rights were ignored by Parliament for decades. It wasn't until a second generation of suffragists came to the fore and escalated their tactics that the government was forced to pay attention. The suffragists fought hard with civil disobedience, property destruction, and arson. Thousands of militant women went to prison where they faced isolation and abuse. But in the end, their campaign succeeded. Women won the vote in England and soon in many other countries as well. Resistance groups often go after the economy. In Nigeria, the movement for the emancipation of the Niger Delta has targeted oil infrastructure and on more than one occasion forced a 70% decrease in oil output. Holy shit, 70%. That is a lot. From the Boston Tea Party to the Montgomery bus boycott to the African National Congress, resistance struggles have gone after the economies of the ruling class because it is so incredibly effective. It's time for us to move from dissidence to resistance. As the co-founder of the Suffragist Women's Social and Political Union, Christabel Pankhurst wrote, quote, "We know that relying solely on argument, we wandered for 40 years politically in the wilderness. We know that arguments are not enough and that political force is necessary," end quote. Or as the civil rights song went, quote, "The only thing we did was wrong, staying in the wilderness too long. I know the one thing we did right was the day we started to fight," end quote. In this book, I will show how resistance movements form and organize in practical terms, how and why people join movements, and how to encourage that process, how groups form and organize themselves to be as effective and safe as possible, whether they are organizing above ground or underground, the rules and practices they use to stay secure, to protect themselves, and to limit infiltration and repression by prosecution. I will illustrate how people and groups communicate and stay connected so that they can spread their message, coordinate with allies, and navigate their relationship with the mass media. How organizations gather the intelligence and information they need to make smart decisions and understand their adversaries' weak points, and how resistance movements hamper their opponents' attempts to gather that information about them, and how they cope with attacks on their movement through secret disruption or overt repression. Next.
I will discuss about how they raise money, how they support themselves, and how they organize the fundamental logistics that underpin any long-term struggle. The closing chapters of the book will discuss how those movements take effective action through their tactics and the principles that guide successful strategy and allow movements to integrate these different capacities. But before we can get to those practicalities, we must have a better understanding of what makes a movement work. We must understand what it means to fight to win and why we have been held back. And we must understand how to deploy the full range of appropriate tactics we have available. It's time to stop wandering in the political wilderness. This book is about fighting and winning. Chapter 2, Fighting to Win. This is a quote from Ngugi wa Thiong'o Matigari. Quote, "The enemy can never be driven out by words alone, no matter how sound the argument, nor can the enemy be driven out by force alone. But words of truth and justice, fully backed by armed power, will certainly drive the enemy out. When right and might are on the same side, what enemy can hold out?" End quote. Second quote by Stan Goff. Quote, "One of the qualities that seems to define so many so-called progressives is their utter lack of aggression and their constant moral hand-wringing. This is in large part responsible for their failure to mobilize masses. They only know how to mobilize fear that demoralizes people, instead of mobilizing rage that drives through fear and seizes the initiative. When the masses mobilize, they seek leaders who fight." End quote. Elaho Valley. It's 1999. Confrontation is simmering in the Elaho Valley in British Columbia. Old-growth forest is being clear-cut by International Forest Products, Interfor. Interfor chainsaws its way through the valley, destroying 1,000-year-old cedars, Douglas firs, and hemlocks. Elaho holds some of the biggest trees in Canada, and the famed Elaho giants are the oldest Douglas firs in North America. but those trees are those trees are falling as logging roads and clear cutting on valley slopes cause major erosion, choking fish streams. Next.
The 1990s saw a campaign to slow logging in the Elaho by legal means, but appeals by the Squamish First Nation, letter writing campaigns, and lobbying efforts by wilderness advocacy groups have all been ignored. The government will not listen, and Interfor has a violent hatred of tree huggers. Forest defenders set up peaceful camps in Elaho to monitor and publicize the destruction. Interfor is not happy with the attention. On September 15th, 1999, a mob of 100 loggers descends on the main activist camp. They use Interfor trucks and radios to coordinate their violent attack. The mob burns the camp to the ground, destroying $30,000 worth of recording equipment, along with the camping gear and personal belongings of the forest defenders. Loggers beat 3 people so badly that they must be rushed to the hospital. A 15-year-old boy is among the injured. They come within seconds of crushing one man's skull with a boulder. The word mob might imply that the violent attack is unruly, spontaneous, that it erupted from rash anger, but the attack is premeditated. An Interfor vice president and corporate directors are present in the valley. A judge would conclude that the attack happened with at least tacit corporate approval. The attacks are videotaped by an Interfor employee who later destroys the tape on the orders of a superior. Police take 6 hours to respond to calls for help. On arrival, they arrest peaceful protesters instead of corporate goons. None of the attackers spend even a single day in jail. By the end of the campaign, however, various nonviolent protesters are sentenced to as long as a year in jail for actions like standing on roadways. The attack by Interfor is, by any reasonable definition, a form of terrorism. It is a violent assault designed to intimidate and terrorize people, to try to frighten them away from showing what Interfor does not want to be seen. But it does not work. The attack draws more attention and more activists into the struggle. The attack also triggers tactical innovation by the forest defenders. Peaceful observation, lobbying, and bearing witness have not stopped the logging. Instead, those tactics have resulted in violent attacks on nonviolent people. Some forest defenders quietly decide to try something new. They switch their tactics to cat and mouse games, using the vast area and cover of the forest to move without being seen and to bypass security Interfor has set up on the single logging road. Some activists set up new tree sits. Others quietly sabotage Interfor equipment and spike trees. The most elaborate barricade is set up on Lava Creek Bridge. 100 feet long and 100 feet high, the bridge is the only way to access the northernmost part of Elaho Valley. Forest defenders park a truck sideways on the bridge, fill it with rocks, and cover it with logs and barbed wire. A pipe runs under the bottom of the truck, and a rope running through the pipe connects to a tree sit on the other side of the bridge. This rope is actually holding up the platforms the tree sitters are living on. Signs on the blockade clearly warn that if the blockade is tampered with, the tree sitters could be killed. In July of 2000, dozens of RCMP officers besiege the bridge. The blockaders hold for more than a week, but eventually the RCMP starts to dismantle the blockade. Without giving any warning, the RCMP severs the rope holding the platforms, and 4 tree sitters nearly fall to their deaths. They are able to save themselves with emergency safety lines, but it becomes clear that both the police and Interfor are willing to kill people who get in the way of logging. Confrontations escalate as the year wears on, and so does sabotage. After one of Interfor's giant generators is sabotaged with abrasive powder poured into the crankcase, a communique from a monkey-wrenching group proclaims, "Sabotage is easy. All you need is determination and a little grit." Interfor's corporate machinery also begins to grind to a halt. The rising cost of lawyers, ruined equipment, boycotts, and security are costing them more than the destruction of the destruction of the Elaho Valley is actually worth. Suddenly, they are willing to negotiate. In 2001, a moratorium on logging is declared. Interfor renounces its logging rights. Journalist and forest defender Zoe Blunt explains, the logging rights to the whole watershed now belong to the Squamish Nation, and the area north of Lava Creek is set aside as a wild spirit place to be protected in perpetuity. The battle for the Elaho Valley is won using political and economic force and a diversity of tactics. Next.
I wrote this book because I think we can win. Some years ago, I decided to study Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, a martial art that emphasizes grappling and ground fighting. I did it partly for exercise and partly to get a new perspective on strategic thinking. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu developed from the original Japanese discipline via a young Brazilian man named Helio Gracie. The youngest and smallest brother in his family training, Helio Gracie was not a healthy child, and his doctors forbade strenuous activity. Unable to perform many of the strength-based throws his older brothers learned, Helio watched them and started to create his own system of martial arts, a system a smaller person could defeat a larger and stronger opponent. You can see how this might be useful for resistance. In my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu class, another new student, a young woman, was set against a larger and more experienced student. She began by lying on her back, while the larger student sat on her, one knee on either side of her torso. She flailed around for a few moments, trying to shake him off, but his balance and body weight kept him in place. She put both palms against his chest and pushed as though she could bench press him. It did not work. To push him off, she would have to be able to counter both his strength and his weight. Pushing directly would only make her sweaty and exhausted, while he exerted almost no energy. The point being made, can you scroll up, please? The point being made, our instructor showed her several ways to escape that could work. She had to use her legs, her strongest muscles. In one escape method, she could seize her opponent's arms with both hands to put him off balance, and then push with both legs into the ground and twist to the side, toppling him. Or she could concentrate all her force on shifting one of his knees at a time so that she could slip her own legs free for striking and grappling. These moves did not require brute force. They worked because she applied the force she had in the right place, where she was strong and he was weak. Her actions were also much more effective when used in surprise. If the bigger student knew what was coming, he could shift his weight and adapt to compensate. But once she knew multiple escape moves, she could switch without warning between them, using surprise to catch him off guard and topple him. These very simple principles meant the difference between being able to escape and remaining trapped. She could have pushed against his chest for hours, and nothing would have changed, because she was pushing in the wrong place. When she started pushing in the right place and using the right leverage, things changed very quickly. So it can be with us. Next.
Next is Jen. Are you there, Jennifer?
Oh, yes. I'm so sorry.
It's all good.
Okay. Okay. Then this book is What Makes a Resistant Movement Effective and How to Build One. To do that, we have to bridge several chasms. The chasm that separates our own everyday activism from the spectacular capital R resistance movements, be they glorified or despised, the chasm that separates resistance cultures of present and past, and the chasm that separates ideology and action, theory and practice. A resistant movement is more than a social movement. A resistant movement is a type of social movement that believes basic power structures in society are unjust and act to impede or dismantle those power structures. There are many books about community organizing and community mobilization within the current economic and political systems, but they rarely discuss how to dismantle those systems. Community organizers who preach revolution are prone to lose their funding or to fracture the fragile cooperation that many community organizations depend on. Nor do they discuss how to cope with the attacks that come once an organization truly becomes effective or once it rejects the legitimacy of the status quo. This is not surprising, as community organizations are often pragmatic groups that deal with immediate social and material needs and lack most lack the resources or time to go after root causes of the issues they address. They try to avoid overreaching. On the other end of the spectrum, there exist many wonderful histories of resistant movements ranging from academic tomes to epic films. Though these histories sometimes do a great job of showing the big picture or detailing a particular movement, they rarely link those historical details into the realities of the present day. For an academic writer, advocating political action may mean giving up on the pose of objectivity or a chance at the tenure track. And the filmmaker seeks what will make a dramatic or entertaining show. Unglamorous daily organizing work is usually bumped from the script by a romantic subplot or an extra chase sequence. Revolution is treated as something that happens only in other places and other times. And when profound change happens in movies, it is usually spectacular, spontaneous, and the product of sheer bravery and force of will by individuals rather than collective action. Though resistance and revolution do not need courage and perseverance to succeed, they also require hard work and decidedly non-spectacular community organizing. They are not spontaneous manifestations of outrage. They may be triggered or accelerated by unexpected events or opportunities, but successful movements are usually built on a foundation of good organization. Rosa Parks' refusal to move to the back of the bus appeared from the outside to be a spur-of-the-moment act of defiance that triggered an entire community to rise up. In actuality, civil rights organizers had been carefully planning for months. A campaign had almost been triggered early when another young black woman named Claudette Colvin refused to give up her seat under similar circumstances. But Colvin was pregnant while unmarried, and so organizers decided to go with someone who appeared more virtuous, older, and more able to engage sympathy and rally support to their planned boycott. That person, Rosa Parks, was not just a tired woman on her way home, but an activist and NAACP staffer. Parks was also lighter skinned than Colvin, which organizers thought would help to invoke the sympathy of white people in particular. One might also think, from viewing footage of civil rights protests or from the way that the civil rights struggle is often portrayed, that those in power were persuaded to change their hearts by the groundswell of opposition to segregation as expressed through the signal waving, signaling, and marching. Some people see the civil rights struggle as essentially the same as any courteous modern-day protest against ecocide or corporate globalization or foreign wars. Polite marches are good protests, while other forms of action, armed self-defense or the destruction of property, belong to a fundamentally different category of bad actions, only undertaken by the morally underdeveloped. In this way of thinking, if you don't succeed by polite protests, the problem is that you haven't persuaded enough people to march with you, and not that those in power are intransigent liars who will do or say anything to advance their agenda of the rich. The belief that civil rights were primarily about changing hearts of the elite is wrong. It is a form of magical thinking that doesn't conform to historical reality. Civil rights were won not because they persuaded those in power to change, but because they engaged in a direct struggle with the apparatus of segregation, using methods I'll review shortly, and forced to change despite the wishes of many intractable racists in power. Nor is there any clear dividing line between good symbolic protest and bad direct action. That separation is an illusion. Instead, there is a continuous spectrum, and on that spectrum, civil rights confrontations like the Freedom Riders are much closer to the guerrilla warfare than to symbolic marches. From an organizer's perspective, the nonviolent civil rights conflicts in the United States and armed insurgencies around the world are more alike than they are different. Consider the similarities between anti-colonial revolutions in Algeria or Vietnam and the Freedom Riders or the lunch counter sit-ins. Both require people to be recruited and trained to enter life and death situations, to follow combat discipline and their rules of engagement, even in moments of unmitigated terror. But required well-developed logical networks in the case of the guerrillas to provide food, ammunition, and medical aid, and in the case of the Montgomery boycott to provide scheduled carpals and replacement shoes to people who had worn theirs out from walking. Both required intelligence networks to identify effective targets, and both required coherent strategies to reach their goals. There are many other commonalities. Many of our obstacles have been part of the cultures of the left. So I should clarify some of the terms I've been using, especially liberal and radical. Some people use radical as a synonym for extreme, but that's misleading. The word radical originates in Latin, where it means of the roots, as in from the grassroots or root problems. Radicals see the dominant culture as having deep-seated problems that require fundamental changes to fix. They want to uproot entrenched power structures like apartheid and patriarchy or capitalism. As such, they tend to advocate, or at least support, political actions that falls outside of what the political establishment considers acceptable. Phil Barrington's argument that if, quote, if voting changed anything, it would be illegal, end quote, is something radicals understand well. Liberals, in contrast, see the problem in society as comparatively superficial. They accept most of the established power structures of society, say corporations or the parliamentary state, and they seek to work within those structures to make change. Liberals try to use, quote, representative systems of political power, either by electing someone sympathetic to them or by persuading someone already in power to grant concessions. Radicals may do this at times, but radicals also like to build up their own community power and create movements that can exert political force more directly. Then there is a picture of an arrow with the top at radical. It says radical with, in quotes, the system must be transformed or dismantled, end quote. And then the next quote is fundamental changes are necessary, end quote. At the bottom, it's liberal. And in quotes, it says we can work within the system, end quote. And then below that, it says, end quote, reforms are sufficient, end quote. These are rather different approaches to potential for conflict, but these aren't two distinct groups. There is a spectrum from liberalism to radicalism, and a person might move around on the spectrum through their lives depending on their experiences and current events. Someone who thinks in radical terms might participate in a liberal campaign when imminent progress seems possible, or someone who thinks in liberal terms might take on radical action or even become more radical politically if they've exhausted their traditional political opinions without success. There is another related political tension between militants and moderates. Moderates tend to prioritize dialogue, compromise, and incremental changes. They usually prefer low-risk action that will make slow but continuous progress towards their goal. Militants, on the other hand, prioritize confrontation with power. They want to fight those in power, to show defiance, and to directly obstruct or dismantle systems of oppression. Militants want to make rapid or immediate progress towards their goal. They are willing to undertake riskier action to make that progress, and they are often intolerant of anyone they see as slowing them down. There's another arrow picture. The top is militant, the bottom is moderate. At the top, the militant says, in quotes, change happens through struggle, disruption, and conflict, end quote. And then the next quote is, we must confront injustice directly, end quote. under moderate, it says change happens gradually by communication and understanding.
Do you want to switch to the next person, Jen?
That's great. Thanks.
You gotta scroll up. Thank you. Moderates want to mediate conflict, while militants want to engage in conflict and to polarize. A classic comparison would be between Martin Luther King Jr., a moderate, and Malcolm X, militant. Of course, Martin Luther King Jr. was quite militant compared with some, which demonstrates how relative these concepts are. The contrast between Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont, discussed in chapter 11, is even more illuminating. Oh no. Serious. Okay. Now we got another drawing. We got 4 quadrants. We've got militant, radical, moderate, liberal. And in the upper left quadrant, we have militants. And the quotes for those is, change happens through struggle, disruption, and conflict. We must confront injustice directly. And then moving clockwise, with radical in the upper right quadrant, it says, the system must be transformed or dismantled. Fundamental changes are necessary. And then in the bottom right quadrant, it says moderate, and the quote is, change happens gradually by communication and understanding. And then in the bottom left quadrant, we have liberal with the quote, we can work within the system, reforms are sufficient. The political axes of moderate, militant, and liberal radical may seem equivalent, but they are not. It's true that liberals are often moderates and radicals are often militants, but that's not inevitable and it's not universal. I've worked with plenty of radicals who were also moderates, who sought to make fundamental changes in power dynamics of their communities using low-risk action to make gradual changes. And I've worked with liberal militants who were willing to fight to make changes within the established power structures. In any case, all of these approaches have a time and a place in the resistance struggles. Next section is victory and defeat. If we want to win, no matter how moderate or militant we are, we have to understand how movements have succeeded in the past. Gene Sharp has written extensively on how to end dictatorships, the principles of which apply to abolishing any entrenched and exploitative system of power. In his book, From Dictatorship to Democracy, he argues, when one wants to bring down a dictatorship most effectively and with the least cost, then one has 4 immediate tasks. One being strengthen the oppressed population themselves in their determination, self-confidence, and resistance skills. Second being strengthen the independent social groups and institutions of the oppressed people. The third being create a powerful internal resistance force. And the final one is develop a wise, grand strategic plan for liberation and implement it skillfully. He concludes, against a strong, self-reliant force, given wise strategy, disciplined and courageous action, and genuine strength, the dictatorship will eventually crumble. It seems clear that the left in general has failed to do these things. Beginning with Sharp's final bullet and working backwards, there has been a serious deficit of strategic thinking in general, let alone grand strategy. Most of the left does not understand or accept the legitimacy of serious resistance, especially if it involves mobilizing political force outside the electoral system. The independent social groups have institutions of the left, from unions to sympathetic media, have withered, often with considerable assistance from the established left. And lastly, the left's determination, self-confidence, and resistance skills are seriously lacking, largely because of a refusal to fight and an insistence on forms of protest that have not historically been responsible for success. What we need, and what Sharp argues for, is a culture of resistance. What we have is a culture of defeat. This is my favorite section. People do not like to feel ineffective, powerless, or downtrodden. An old saying suggests that those who can't fix a bad situation will virtue of necessity. That is, if you can't change your situation materially, you can psychologically adjust by rationalizing or even glorifying the things you feel you can't change. So if I feel politically marginalized, maybe that's not because I'm not effectively reaching out to other people, but because all other people are irretrievably corrupted. In that case, it's good to be politically marginal because that means I'm politically pure. And if we are unable to mobilize political force against those in power, maybe the problem isn't strategy or recruitment. Maybe it's because we shouldn't mobilize political force. And only by throwing ourselves entirely on the mercy of those in power will we finally transform their hearts. So cute. Michael Albert, in his insightful short book, The Trajectory of Change, argues today's activism, for want of revolutionary designs and spirit, is often ill-informed, frequently lacks integrity, and virtually never incorporates the kind of logic, solidarity, and spirit that can sustain long-term involvement by suffering constituencies. Current movements are most often too narrow, too lacking in scope, and in spiritual and moral appeal to attract wide support. Remarkably, they often celebrate their very weakness, their lack of vision, their lack of breadth, and their lack of anything resembling audacity and passion, as if these debits were virtues. I believe that when a group of people are unable to effect change over a long period of time, they may develop a culture of defeat. They may make virtues out of dysfunctional habits. There are cultural tendencies common on the left that are part of a culture of defeat. Next.
The first is personal purity. Unable to mobilize effectively to transform systems of power, activists focus on lifestyle changes like clothing, diet, and consumerism. A resistance movement is hard, but it's easy to say, stop wearing leather. And if everyone could just drink fair trade organic coffee or hitchhike instead of driving a car, the problem would be solved, right? A consumerist approach is also encouraged by marketers who want to profit from genuine urges for sustainability and justice by directing them into capitalist eco-chic. Maybe the purity is spiritual rather than material, and the objective is to empty one's heart of all hate while looking down one's nose at the vulgar people who would stain their souls with the messy business of protest and disruption. Or maybe it is a political purity, a more revolutionary than thou approach that dismisses anyone who would dirty their hands with anything less than the immediate and complete, or completely hypothetical, transformation of everything. In any case, once personal purity becomes the end goal, social movements turn on themselves. Their day-to-day purpose is no longer to organize and fight power, but to police their comrades, to criticize and exclude those who are insufficiently pure. Feminist Joe Freeman's insights into this are explored in Chapter 5. The next of these is horizontal hostility. Having failed to fight against those in power, people take out their anger and frustrations on each other. It's a lot easier to fight the person sitting next to you than someone in a distant House of Parliament or corporate headquarters. And if the victory continues to elude them, it's because their would-be allies are reactionaries, or vanguardists, or dangerous anarchists and vandals. People who are willing to fight back often have more fiery and combative personalities, so such conflict is easy to provoke. The term horizontal hostility was coined by Black intersectional feminists or Black intersectionalist feminist and civil rights organizer Florence Kennedy. She called it, quote, misdirected anger that rightly should be focused on the external causes of oppression, end quote. And Hansen explained to me that this phenomenon is so destructive that intelligence agencies, quote, like CSIS and the RCMP, don't have to spend 1 cent in our communities because people spend all their time attacking each other over the little things instead of talking about strategy, end quote. Michael Albert, writing about what happens to people who encounter a movement for the first time, asks, quote, does this person merge into a growing community of people, feel more secure and appreciated, feel a growing sense of personal worth and of contribution to something valuable, and enjoy a sense of accomplishment? Or does this person meet a lot of other people who continually question her motives and behavior, making her feel insecure and constantly criticized? Next.
Loneliness and withdrawal. This is all, to be frank, very dreary stuff. It is no wonder that many people withdraw from radical communities that are unpleasant or unfulfilling, that they retreat from difficult political life into the relative calm or loneliness of private life. Loneliness in human communities, political or otherwise, is contagious. This isolation and withdrawal can be worsened by the paranoia about state surveillance and persecution. The state wants to encourage this paranoia so that radicals don't reach out to one another. And plenty of radicals are happy to play into this, rather than addressing actual issues of security or safety. Paranoia-inducing counterintelligence schemes are discussed in Chapter 9. People don't only withdraw into solitude. People need community to feel whole. And if they aren't getting that from resistance communities, then they'll find it by withdrawing from political engagement into apolitical groups that can meet their human needs, or by withdrawing into a social media simulation of community. Symbolic actions. In a culture of defeat, people do not know what actions will be effective, or they feel that no actions will make any difference. If nothing makes a difference, there's no point in taking any risks. So people stick to polite protests, letter writing, or the like. Conversely, militants in a culture of defeat may carry out actions that are spectacular but ultimately still symbolic. That said, the difference between symbolic and direct action is not as important as decisive, shaping, and sustaining actions, explored in Chapter 11, Actions and Tactics. Vague goals and no strategy. Devising strategy is a complex and iterative process. To develop strategy, you try different things. You see what works and what doesn't, and then you adjust your approach based on what you've learned. But for that to work, you have to A, try different things in the first place, B, correctly identify what has been successful and what hasn't, and C, have enough success to learn what works. Without clear, concrete, short-term goals to rally around, people with different political ideas can't find common ground. And if they can't fight together, they'll fight each other. Those are some main elements of a culture of defeat. The psychological results of this culture are loneliness, apathy, depression, and learned helplessness. This is precisely the psychological state that those in power want us to have, and that their counterintelligence programs and psychological operations are meant to evoke. See Chapter 9, Counterintelligence and Repression. Horizontal hostility worsens all of these feelings. If you can't trust your allies to refrain from attacking you, then where can you find safe harbor? Where can you find a haven from which to organize and plan action? Unrestrained and unconstructive anger between allies and comrades is deeply demoralizing. But I believe that one of the strongest signs of a culture of defeat on the liberal left is the abandonment of anger. The mainstream left has a tremendous fear of anger. It is afraid to feel angry or to express anger at those in power. Somewhere along the way, many people began to put feeling anger and taking action in the same category as napalming a village or beating protesters. Anger is a totally appropriate and valid response to witnessing or experiencing injustice. To try to quash that legitimate feeling is not an act of moral superiority, but of helplessness. Those who are truly helpless will do what they must to cope. But let us not make a virtue of self-disempowerment. The refusal to feel anger or despair or many other appropriate feelings is a refusal to confront the reality of our situation and the pervasiveness of global injustice. Next.
Obviously, taking out anger on our own friends or colleagues can be a destructive form of horizontal hostility. Uncontrollable and inappropriate anger can damage a movement and hamper action, but we can say the same about uncontrollable and inappropriate fear, sadness, cheeriness, anxiety, or any other emotion, even love. How many women have refused to leave violent domestic situations because they love or claim to be loved by their abusive partners? Black intellectual Lerone Bennett Jr. wrote about the condemnation of anger in 1964. He argued, "The harsh fact is that the choice for most Negroes is not between hating or loving, but between hating and hating, between hating themselves or hating their oppressors. You cannot deny people the basic emotions of rage, resentment, and yes, hate. Only slaves or saints or masochists love their oppressors. If you humiliate a man, if you degrade him, if you do this over and over for hundreds of years, he will either hate you or hate himself. Or perhaps he will hate the closest to him, his comrades." Horizontal hostility drives people apart, and fragmented movements of isolated people are not effective. For one, this fragmentation creates homogeneous, siloed groups. Combatants are grouped with other combatants, but too often lack the resources to reach out to community members and get the support they need. Moderate community organizers might have strong social connections and resources, but lack allies with a militant edge to undertake necessary risks and confrontations. These divisions are bad because resistance movements are most effective when they are diverse, when they have a heterogeneous mixture of different skills and backgrounds. This makes them robust and gives them the strategic capacity essential to success. A culture of defeat is commonplace. What we need is a culture of resistance. Where a culture of defeat insists on personal purity, we need to see integrity in action. Where we have horizontal hostility, we need solidarity. Where we have loneliness and withdrawal, we need community engagement. Where we have symbolic actions and vague goals, we need effective action and concrete objectives. And where we have emotional suppression, we need ways of directing legitimate feelings into world-changing work. One of the most important ways to overcome a culture of defeat is by winning. And movements that don't do that, they tend to turn inward. The iron law of involution. Political activists have been trying to build healthy alternative communities for thousands of years. Many of the cultural values we take for granted have been passed down over centuries. In the 1800s, community experimentation was intense in Europe and North America, where the rise of capitalism, urbanism, and industrialization drove a movement to try to recover a sense of human scale and peace in rural communities. Hundreds of communes were founded to pursue this cause. Sociologist Rosabeth Moss Kanter studied 19th century communes in the United States to see which factors helped those communes succeed or fail. She found that the communes were most likely to endure when they institutionalized exclusivity. That is, they deliberately and emphatically set themselves apart from the outside world. They were isolated geographically, they grew their own food, and were economically self-sufficient. They often used special dress or language, the same way that some old order Amish or Mennonites dress in specific old-fashioned ways or speak a form of German. They had rules about how and when people could enter or leave the commune. Of the successful communities, fully 75% refused to recognize American patriotic holidays. About 50% refused to read outside newspapers, and at least 25% considered the world outside the commune to be wicked. In addition to severing their bonds to the outside world, successful communes made efforts to build strong internal bonds. They worked together, they ate together, they sang and prayed together, they made decisions together. All of these collective acts strengthened relationships among members of the community and increased their sense of personal investment in the project of the commune. You can see the same patterns at work in many enduring political subcultures. They may have their own distinctive dress, whether black hoodies or tie-dye. They have their own slang or jargon and shared cultural projects, from the consensus decision-making to punk shows. Next.
The deliberate self-isolation of Conter's successful communities lives on in many contemporary radical communities. Viewed through her lens, elements of a culture of defeat make more sense. Excluding and policing others over political purity are ways of preserving radical community when under attack. It can be very difficult for radical philosophies to survive without isolating themselves, especially if the alternative to exclusivity is sometimes to be swallowed up by the dominant culture. Conter's analysis is informative, but we don't want to simply imitate the factors that made commune successful. Yes, we want to strengthen communities and retain members, but it's not good enough to simply withdraw from society. We want to change society. We don't just want to hide away. We want to build what Eric Hirsch calls havens, social or physical places where radical ideas can develop and flourish while enabling people in those communities to go out and change the larger world. The practical balance between inclusion and exclusion is one that all social movements must cope with. Failure to find balance often means defeat. Jane Mansbridge, who has studied the ups and downs of feminist movements since the 1970s, can help us to understand this. She writes about what she calls the iron law of involution. Quote, if social movements cannot reward their members materially, i.e. through victory or short-term gains, and if the activists must find their rewards in ideology and solidarity, we might expect such movements to follow an iron law of involution, by which every social movement tends to splinter into sects unless it wins quickly, in which case it turns into a collection of institutions. End quote. Mansbridge continues, quote, the socialist movement in America illustrates this iron law. As Daniel Bell argues, it foundered on the tension between inclusion and exclusion. The labor movement turned into an institution, while the Communist Party turned into a sect. The party became ideologically exclusive, the very commitment of its members stemming in part from that inward dread of not proving sufficiently revolutionary, which hounds us all. Its members also became social isolates, cut off from others, not only because others ostracized them, but also because they needed isolation to avoid confronting the wide gap between their revolutionary expectations and their actual achievements. And so Mansbridge, end quote, and so Mansbridge argues they became unable to relate or even interact comfortably people who weren't part of their particular communist sect. Perhaps this sounds familiar? Mansbridge believes that the feminist movement has been relatively successful because it has been able to balance the needs of inclusion and exclusion. Being ineffective and fragmented is clearly bad for a movement, but being effective is also dangerous because any success will bring down repression. In the light of such attacks on effective groups, some of the paranoia and isolation of parts of the left is more understandable. Threats posed by systemic attacks from the right wing and government programs like COINTELPRO are real and well documented. See Chapter 9. That said, I think that most of the immediate obstacles to building communities of resistance aren't from the right wing, they're from the left. Too much of the left is unwilling to fight. Worse than that, it actually condemns those who do want to fight. It does this in part because of a lack of self-awareness, and in part because it has so fully accepted the ideological framework and perceived legitimacy of those in power. Next.
I think we're right at 8:30. Well, 8:28.
Yeah, we are basically like 2 minutes short of the reading period. How far are we? We could just like read this very last part until we get to the liberal class, and that'll give us a good ending, and then we can move to discussion. Who would be reading next?
Should be me.
Let's see here. Do you just want to read from 3 dots down to liberal class?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Be Being ineffective and fragmented is clearly bad for a movement, but being effective is also, I think we already read this part, is also dangerous because any success will bring down repression. In the light of such attacks on effective groups, some of the paranoia and isolation of parts of the left is more understandable. Threats posed by systematic attacks from the far right and government programs like COINTELPRO are real and well documented. See Chapter 9. That said, I think most of the immediate obstacles to building communities of resistance aren't from the right wing, they're from the left. Too much of the left is unwilling to fight. Worse than that, it actually condemns those who do want to fight. It does this in part because of a lack of self-awareness, and in part because it has so fully accepted the ideological framework and perceived legitimacy of those in power. This is made very clear by the work of people like Thomas Lindsay and other organizers in the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. They run, quote, democracy schools, end quote, in towns around the United States and organize communities to defend themselves against companies that want to bring in fracking among other offenses. Lindsay and the CELDF have had quite a bit of success, but it's mostly been in small and relatively conservative towns. Lindsay explains, the hardest part to work are the liberal progressive communities. The hardest places to work are the liberal progressive communities because they think we have a democracy and they are intent on working within the existing structure to try to find a remedy rather than tossing it and working on something from scratch. ... I think that difference in approach has become clear to me over the last decade. Here are rural conservatives passing things saying we won't let our rights be taken away and are using a local law as a municipal collective civil disobedience tool to actually push up against the state to say, fuck you. Whereas in Berkeley, people get in a huff and do some hand-wringing and pass a resolution which begs and pleads Congress to do something about corporate rights, which is never going to happen. ... This makes a lot of sense to me and underscores some of the frankly delusional beliefs that have become commonplace among a certain group of privileged leftists we can dub the liberal class.
Okay. So that concludes the reading portion of our session this evening. So now we can move on to the discussion portion. And as usual, I just want to open up the floor to people here in the reading group. What kind of thoughts did you have while we were reading through that section? I mean, we read through the section on the culture of defeat, so I assume people have a lot of thoughts on that part. So, were there any of the parts of the culture of defeat that people feel like they recognize, that they see around them in organizing spaces or online? There are things like personal purity, horizontal hostility, loneliness and withdrawal, symbolic actions, vague goals, and no strategy.
Oh God, everywhere. That's like the basis of every online quote unquote leftist community I've ever checked out and promptly checked out of.
Yeah, I mean, I would have to agree. Literally, I did a video on the channel because I found that this was so significant and I've seen it so much. For me personally, the personal purity and the horizontal hostility part, it's just rampant.
I was interested in the quasi political compass, the radical militant way to lay it out. I thought that was a really good good way to shift kind of the perspective on the typical political compass that we see.
Yeah, I was wondering about that when I first saw it, and then I realized that it doesn't actually correlate to the one that I'm used to seeing. Because, yeah, it's like, I don't know. These little charts are always like real difficult to explain. They get way more complicated too.
Yeah, here I found it interesting that because this is not a typical framing of this, right? Like usually this is not the way people describe all of this. These aren't on spectrums, It's not like on the other side of radical is liberal usually. Usually we would say, somebody would be moderate if they were the opposite of radical would be moderate is the way we usually say it. But he sees it that liberals are basically the opposite of radicals because they believe we can work within the system, whereas radicals recognize you have to change the system itself, which I think makes sense. But for him, the opposite of moderate is militant, which I can see that. One is an axis about action, and the other one is an axis about one's conception of what needs to be changed and their theory of change.
Missed this whenever we were reading it initially, but I went back and was looking through these parts of the culture of defeat, and the loneliness and withdrawal is one that I keep kind of returning to and thinking about how like insidious this particular uh, part of this psychology is, and at the very end of this part, it's got this bit about then they'll find it by withdrawing from political engagement into apolitical groups that can meet their human needs, or by withdrawing into a social media simulation of community. And I feel like that really I've got half-baked thoughts about that right now, but that feels really huge in terms of this entire specifically in the environment that we're in today, where it's so difficult to bring organizing from the online spaces into uh actual physical spaces. There's something there.
Go ahead, Dom.
I might be speaking a little ahead here, but on the section where he's talking about a lot of the left's problem is we're afraid to feel angry. I tend to agree with that. We all tend to be so restrained and so afraid of, making ourselves look bad that we forget that at some point we're going to look bad no matter what we do. We need to just get angry and get through it.
I feel like that's definitely true for liberals. And even when they say they're angry, they do not behave the way that an angry person would. They're not demonstrative about it at all. But also, like, I feel like with radicals and extremists, like, anger is like all they have, which is frustrating because the emotion of it, like anger or love or hope, whatever those feelings, those feelings will fade away. Like you'll run out of them at some point, and then if you don't have necessity backing it up, then that's where I see people like dropping out and just adopting the purity politics of like the way that we change things is by changing our hearts or something. I definitely see liberals just like they I think it's like still high school for them where like you don't ever show the bully that you're mad at them, or don't act out. They're like a managerial, governing entity.
I agree with that. I would say another way to frame that is that rage needs to have somewhere to point. If you can't point it
By the
somewhere,
way, hey
and it's
Dom,
just
you sound kind of distant from your mic.
How about that? Is that a little better?
So much better.
All right. Another way to frame that would be that rage needs somewhere to point. If you're just washing out rage all over the field, then you're not getting anything done. Your emotions have to see some sort of success, and that means applying them in a direction.
Yeah, somebody in the stream chat said something really similar. Self-restraint is the ideal, but that's not in contrast to the human feeling of anger. The book mentioned that anger needs to be channeled correctly, exactly like you said. I think that's really important. Because like we've all kind of experienced this person who's really angry, they're really outraged, but they don't channel it properly, and it's just like there's this constant fallout and tension, and it seems like it's like they're always right on the edge of getting angry at their own comrades all the time, you know. And I think that can contribute to that horizontal hostility and the feelings of loneliness and all of that. So it's like, you know, the anger has to be channeled properly, or else it just kind of festers like a you know, wound.
Yeah, I agree that the direction of anger and hate, I think it's like, yeah, it's less about not feeling it, in my opinion, than where it's directed at. It's making me think of this text I just read about um, hate by David Graeber, and like today. So it's kind of a funny coincidence, but I didn't agree with it. Like he was talking about how it's not okay to hate anymore, but the example he was giving is like people who are against the sentence, um, hate the sin, love the sinner. And I'm like, no, that sentence needs to go in the garbage. But at the end, he was talking about how before people had to like lived in more like a smaller, more insular communities, like earlier in history, and then you kind of needed to get like to deal with the hate. And I was like, I feel like to me, he was talking about conflict. I don't know, I would call that hate. To me, that's a different thing. Um, but something that's not so much in that section. Maybe it could be under like the horizontal hostility, but definitely something that but the word conflict wasn't there so much in terms of, yeah, like the our capacity to deal with conflict in the sense of like societally and through our actions, but also within interpersonal relationships, because although we end up being very isolated, there is well, for some people, and there's less of a kind of necessity. I mean, it's not true, like we need that, but like I don't know if I'm being clear. Like it's, even though it has dire consequences, it's easier for people to withdraw rather from any kind of conflict than to confront it head on. And also we don't have the tools because we're lacking practice, is in discourage to be in conflict, like a constructive conflict, and try to fix it so we can continue living with each other and fighting with each other. Yeah.
I agree, and I think that the fact that they brought up the kind of entire spectrum of emotions that have to be directed and channeled in the right ways um, was really telling. Conflict resolution being something that we're so terrible at, just like on the large scale of society that we're in, because if we don't want to deal with a certain person, we can just pretend that they don't exist because there's the rest of this huge world and all of that. Um, hang on, I'll come back to that. But I think, Dom, did you have something to say?
Well, I do. I think that it's just that we've gotten this culture of disposability And now people are so used to that being able to just throw anything away that isn't like, that's even slightly damaged. And now we're applying that to each other. We're applying that to people. And just like you said, if you have any kind of a conflict with somebody else, they just throw that person away, and there's a whole other world that you can just pick from. But the thing is, like, you can never build anything with anybody if you can't have that healthy conflict. You just have, like, you're just like well, I think in romantic relationships, they call it like a serial monogamous, where the person is just dating people back to back to back to back to back. And instead of just having one person that they, try to create something lasting with. And I think people do that with friendships. And I think people do that um, with organizing and their comrades. But yeah, I think all of that is culture of defeat.
I want to be clear about something that I think sometimes disengaging, at the very least temporarily, is the good thing to do, so to cool spirits and to, like, pressure people to stay in constant communications until an issue is resolved can be a tactic of abuse. So when I was talking about tools, like to recognize these things and not accept them, but also having the tools to work out, like we were saying, like work out conflicts in a healthy way. Yeah, we need lots of training with that, for sure.
I think that's like one of the big weak spots in the movement, is finding that balance. Because yeah, I mean, it's totally the case that, like, sometimes if two people are having like a really bad argument or a big dispute, that the last thing you actually want is to have them to, like, forced to continue arguing with each other. It's actually maybe better sometimes to let them have a little bit of room. um I guess the thing is that, there's often this sort of fear that, well, if they don't resolve it, it's just going to fester, because that is so much the case so often. And so there's always just this tightrope that has to be walked, where it's like, y'all need to deal with your shit, yet at the same time we can't just keep, when people are just smashing their heads against each other, we can't just force them to continue smashing their heads against each other. But I think that's really why, the movement really needs to build up some expertise about conflict resolution and, restorative justice as a process. And I mean, it's easier said than done. I think that I talked to lots of people who agree. In fact, I think I've heard that conversation like twice in just the last few weeks, in real organizing spaces. But, like, what it really comes down to is that that's a whole, like, profession. Being a mediator, being a good mediator, and being able to actually resolve large scale problems. That's not one of those skills you learn on the side. I mean, maybe you can, but that's one of those skills that people devote their entire lives to becoming good at. Think about the fact that, like, their diplomats are international diplomats are like full-time diplomats. They aren't just doing it on the side. um, and it's tough, mediating between many different interests, being able to discern between abuse and harassment and just normal conflict. That's all really challenging stuff.
Well, I think that, like, a really big thing is like really thinking about the difference between having conflict to win and having conflict to progress and move on. So I think that the majority of times that I see anybody, the vast majority of times that I see people in conflict, both of them are looking to win, but they're not looking to, like, come to a resolution and progress past it. Like, they're just so entirely focused on, like, winning, that it gets nowhere.
So you don't need to raise your hand if there's a spot to go. You can just go ahead.
Oh, right on. Yeah, involving the conflict between two people and the like discussion on solitude. Um, when you're in like a consistent group environment, you're dealing with a number of people who are all communicating amongst themselves at different points, and there's no like just one-on-one relationships. There's kind of like a not necessarily a group wisdom, but a self-checking kind of thing that happens because everybody's kind of got everybody's back. You see the same principle with sports teams where you may have different subgroups within the group, overall, where there might be a big conflict between two people, a quarterback and his lineman or something like that. But there's, different groups that can come in and kind of like help pick that up. And I think that's another important reason to be, reaching out and to avoid like where the separation that we've started to see, especially on the left, an insular nature of people on the online left, how just negative it is. Because like you said, when conflict arises, it's easy to just kind of move all the way away from that one person, and then you're not really a part of the group, so you don't feel tethered to a connection to try to fix anything.
Anybody else got any thoughts on really anything we've read through here? It seems like naturally we're returning to the section on the culture of defeat. I mean, it seems like it's very, very important. But, also if anybody has thoughts on the rest of what we read, which is not for me to say that I'm trying to discourage you from discussing it. I think that it's very much should be the discussion of this session. But, just wanted to also, if anybody had any other thoughts, feel free to interject those.
I would just say that I'm really excited to get to, I mean, I'm loving everything about this book so far, but I'm really excited to get to the chapter 11 actions and tactics. To kind of start digging further into like the lines between symbolic actions and like it, because it says here, that said, the difference between symbolic and direct action is not as important as decisive shaping and sustaining actions explored in chapter 11. So I'm really excited to get there once we've kind of laid this other groundwork.
Yeah, I don't know if I think I may have told you this before, but like part of my favorite thing about this book that makes me love it so much is that it is so focused on tactics, and we're really early in, but I'm also very eager to get to the part where we're actually like really dissecting like different tactics and where they fail, where they succeed. Yeah, I love this book. The second time around is just even just as good.
Yeah, there's a reason why we finished. So for people that are watching on live stream, we actually finished a complete reading of volume 1, but we didn't do it on live stream. We just did it in a personal Jitsi, kind of like you see here. And we like continued on and began volume 2, and then partway through volume 2 we were like, damn, this just seems like too juicy not to make it something more significant, right? Like it feels like more people should be like listening to this reading, they should be interacting with the reading, they should be listening to the conversations, and it should be like stored somewhere for posterity, just so that everybody can go back and kind of listen and learn about the book, because it just really seems like it's one of the most important books of the current moment. Like it's eminently practical. Like it does have some theory, but it's mostly not theory. It's mostly just theory of change, if anything, right? It's all strategy and tactics. It's so much about the nitty gritty and just like the necessary things that hold together a movement that brings about change. And so I'm really glad that we started over, And like Zan said, Zan says, I forgot a lot, so I'm glad we're reading it again. There's so much good info in the book. It's like, yeah, I think there was a lot of it that I'm glad to have a second reading of.
It's just so refreshing. Like, I've been reading theory and critique for so many years that I'm just so bored of it. I'm just so bored of it. Like, I know that everything is fucked. Like, I know. I can see that. I am personally affected by the fucked upness of everything. Now, what do we do about it? That's what I want to read. Like, this is it. I want to know, where do we go from here? How do we build towards what we want? Like, I understand an idea of what we want, but also let's get a roadmap and a lantern or something.
Agree, and I think that that's one of the things that's missing from, specifically like spaces where people go because they want to learn about these things, because they want the education. They get book titles dropped on them that are like these thick pieces of theory, and like that's really important foundational stuff. But it's also not the most accessible entry point, and it's not always going to be an engine toward something actionable. A lot of people get thrown this kind of theory get this theory thrown at them. They're like, well, what the hell do I do with this? And this feels so constructive.
Yeah, the thing is, like, the theory that was written, like, a lot of people, if you ask like somebody on the general radical left, most of the time you're going to be referred to Marx, where it'll be like either the Communist Manifesto, which is just a tiny little 20-page pamphlet, or like Das Kapital, which is like a massive, like 2-volume giant thing. And it's dry, it's verbose, it's using language. And the thing is, like, people talk about, well, Marx wrote it in accessible language for people living in the 1800s. We're so, like, linguistic drift is so far past that point that I think most people picking it up today would be just completely put to sleep. But like something like this that's in common language, and you know it's more useful instead of just criticizing. I feel like this is a way better starting point, because I don't know a single person who like, I rarely ever meet anybody who has no clue that our current system is bad. So yeah, I like this as a starting point.
Oh, sorry. No, now that you say that, it occurs to me that when somebody asks for an introductory book, this is probably what we should just universally be telling them to read. Instead of telling them to read some introductory theory, which is great, we should start them on this, right? We should start them on just like, first learn praxis. Just at least have an overview. Even if you come to disagree with him at some point, that's fine. But you should start with this. This should be the training wheels for people in the movement, not starting them with a piece of introductory theory, which it's
If
fine.
they're coming to us asking for that if they're coming to us asking, like, what do I read? Like, they already know. Like, they're already at the point where they're just wanting to know what to do about it. I agree.
Yeah, I think that we should more prioritize teaching them what the practical actions are to do things more than just the theory. I think that after they understand the practical actions to do things and they kind of have a good overview, I think it's going to be a lot easier to give them some piece of theory, because all at once I think this theory will speak to them in a different kind of way. Like, I think it'll have so much more context when they're like, oh, I see how that fits into the story, like, oh, okay, and I see how that's different from what some people might suggest. Like, oh, that's like this other example I've heard of because I read Full Spectrum Resistance. I think that he does a really good job giving people a framework to even understand politics or how to organize to begin with. So yeah, no, I think that's definitely how I'm going to be thinking about it from now on. I also want to note we only have about 2 minutes left. So I wonder if anybody has any kind of closing thoughts or last things they want to note before we call it a day.
Yes, 1 week from now, everybody show up for the popular education. I skipped last time because I was too busy having fun, I guess, or something, or resting. Yes, that was what it was. But same time next week, next Monday, 7:30, I have a different Jitsi link, which if you reach out to us on any of our social media pages, I will be the one to respond, except YouTube. I think Daniel is managing YouTube. And we will get you the link. And the popular education group that I lead, we're watching more introductory level videos, which this is fairly introductory level reading, as we were just discussing. However, a lot of people learn better through watching videos. So I want to invite everyone to come to that as well. That includes literally anybody. This group is the popular education is open to anyone and everyone, unlike the organizer education, which is kind of restricted. So that includes the YouTube folks.
Yeah, I also wanted to note, since we saw that somebody began donating to Cooperation Tulsa on the Open Collect. Oh, excuse me. Sorry, I got acid reflux. We saw somebody became a recurring donor on our Open Collective. Whoever that is, if you're listening right now, just reach out to one of us on social media. You can reach out to me wherever you please. And we will give you a link to our Discord. So that's the for anybody that's listening. If you would like a link to the Cooperation Tulsa Discord, go over to Open Collective, the link that I just put there in the chat, become a recurring donor for any amount, and we would happily give you a link to the Cooperation Tulsa Discord. And then you could absolutely as well become part of our reading group and do readings with us like you saw tonight. But with that, we're actually 1 minute over. So seems like that is a good place for us to call it a night. Thanks both to everybody in the Jitsi for coming, and also everybody who's watching on live stream for listening along. That's about it for this time. I'll see y'all next time.
Good night, y'all.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Have a good night, guys.